Slugger podcast is sponsored by Queen's University Belfast. Researchers at Queen's are at the heart of supporting global efforts to understand the coronavirus. To discover more about their research, please visit qeb.ac.uk. So, welcome to the first Slugger podcast. My top choice of guest to kick off our new podcast was Mark Hackett. Mark is an architect and urban designer. He is best known as the architect behind the Mac Art Centre in Belfast, but he also has a keen interest in urban renewal. He was one of the founders of the influential Forum for Alternative Belfast, an organisation that sought to promote imaginative solutions to improving the urban landscape around Belfast. Mark is also a director of City Reparo, a multidisciplinary consultancy with the skills to implement city improvement and transformation. Today, he will be discussing with us his alternative vision for the York St Interchange project. When it comes to roads, there is one guy you need to have in any discussion, and that is Wesley Johnston. Wesley is famous for his Northern Ireland's Roads website, which you can find at wesleyjohnston.com. On his site, he gives a full history of the road network in Northern Ireland, as well as details on all the current and future road building schemes. Wesley literally wrote the book on our roads network with his 2014 book, The Belfast Urban Motorway, Engineering, Ambition and Social Conflict. Wesley is here to give us his take on Mark's alternative proposal, and then we will have a general discussion about the future of our roads network after COVID-19. So thank you both for joining me today. Wesley, to kick things off, can you give us a quick overview of why we need the York St Interchange and a quick history of the project? Because I know it was first proposed over 50 years ago as part of the Belfast Urban Motorway in 1967, and the current plans have been around since 2006. So if anything, it teaches us that if you work in roads, you need immense patience, I would imagine.
Yes, that's right. It's often you hear people saying that such and such a road scheme has been in the pipeline for 50 years. And that's often true because virtually every road scheme we have has its gestation going back to the 1960s. Yes, the Belfast Urban Motorway was conceived in the post-war period. It was first thought of in the 1950s, and that sort of coalesced into a concrete plan, if you excuse the pun, in 1967 for an elevated 3-lane motorway encircling the city centre. Now, back in the 1960s, it was believed that the private car was the future of transport. The railways were really only going to remain for as long as necessary until everyone owned a car. That was the belief. And the urban motorway was designed to allow commuter traffic to come into the city. And the idea was that they would then circulate around the city centre using the urban motorway and then come off at an appropriate point into the city centre. Now, we know now that a plan like that wouldn't have worked because we now know that city centres don't have enough capacity to absorb that many vehicles coming in. But that was the plan. The first phase of the urban motorway, the western phase, started construction actually in the early 1970s, but it had to stop due to the troubles. The people were intimidated off the sites. Public opinion moved on. There was less money. There was then a public inquiry that resulted in the whole thing being scaled down. That turned into Westlink, which opened in 1983. And then that followed 12 years later by the M3 Lagan Bridge, both of which are built on the footprint of the urban motorway, although they're not called that nowadays. The rest of the urban motorway ring was abandoned. That then left the junction at York Street as the focal point of the road network, where the busiest road in Northern Ireland, the M2, meets the second busiest, the M3, and the third busiest, Westlink. All of them meet at this one point with over 100,000 vehicles per day using it. And it's always been a severe bottleneck because despite being the busiest junction in Northern Ireland, it's controlled by surface traffic lights. So in 2006, the plan was resurrected as it had been in 1967 to put a series of flyovers or underpasses at York Street. That plan passed its public inquiry, very nearly got started with construction. There was a contractor was appointed, and money was available from the DUP Tory Pact. There was then a legal challenge by a contractor who hadn't won the contract, which was successful. So the project is going to have to go back out to tender again. But as you say, it's now been 16 years since the current form of the plan was put out, and still nothing's happened on the ground.
And what's the latest budget estimate for the project?
Anywhere up to £160 million. It's difficult to say without going out to tender again, because with construction inflation, the prices like that can fluctuate, but anywhere sort of 125, 165 million, somewhere in that ballpark.
Okay, and do road projects tend to stick to their estimate? Because sometimes you have a bit of skepticism about these kind of public schemes that the cost can kind of go out of control, but the roads have a pretty good reputation of staying on budget.
Well, it depends how you look at it. Road schemes start off when they're first envisaged with an estimated price. And what I've found is that as the design develops, the price tends to go up and up and up. By the time they've got to the point of, seeking a contractor, the price tends not to go up too much after that. And there's been a couple of schemes recently where the price has actually been a little less than forecast, like the A6 and Given to Derry, for example, that has come in slightly cheaper than expected. But yes, in the design phases, the cost tends to go up because there are if you look at York Street, if you dig a hole in the ground, you'll find something there. So there's all kinds of services and things that would have to be moved, and it's a very, very complicated project. It's only when you start digging that you discover some of this stuff.
Okay, so Mark, can you give us a bit of background to how you got kind of involved with your alternative proposals?
Yeah, well, it was when I was working with the Forum for Alternative Belfast, we were obviously looking at all sectors around the city core, and we quickly came across the York St Interchange, which had 4 options at that time, which is really 2 options, up and down as it was called. So there was a time back in around 2010, 11, when I first started looking at this, that there was an option of going up as well, 60 feet into the sky. We always advocated for a few amendments and the more sunken option. And then in 2011-12, I also worked with about 25 University of Ulster students doing some teaching, and we made quite a large model. I'll show a photograph of that. And we were advocating trying to build over sections of the sunken part of the motorway and take a kind of creative urban design approach. So right from the start, I always took the analysis that we had to solve this problem because you had to get the roads connected. From my point of view, as someone living in Belfast, it needed to be done for the people of Belfast. It needed to be done for the residents nearby so they don't have as much pollution at all these traffic lights, and for people walking through that zone. So we called it a shatter zone at the time. Belfast is surrounded by these things we call shatter zones, and you got a road, but also you've got all the connections off that. Almost all of those buildings got taken away in 20, 30 years, and it means that you have enormous sections, hundreds and hundreds of meters of what were former streets, almost devoid of buildings. And that makes it quite intimidating for people to walk, especially at night and in winter when it's, you're not getting reflected light of buildings, you're not walking past something active. It means that whole area is very intimidating to walk and very blank and dark at night for pedestrians.
Was it bad design, or was the kind of troubles influenced? I mean, because I know they had kind of little buffer areas almost, or no man's land, or was it just pure design?
I don't think it was conceived, back in the early 60s, I think, as he says, probably the late 50s, but it kind of got embedded a little bit into the plans of 1962 to 64, which was the urban plan for the whole region, and then published. But so I think then in the implementation, there's kind of evidence that says that the West Link was partly built to cut off the city at that point. In the mid-70s, when the public inquiry was happening, most cities like Nottingham, I think, stopped building their urban motorway, and most cities stopped building their urban motorways through the city centre at around 1980. They all reassessed Glasgow, any of the UK cities that were doing this. So it was a kind of UK sort of tendency and policy. Didn't happen so much in other European cities, and it was probably picking up on American design as well. A lot of American motorways in the 50s and 60s were crashing through cities in a very brutal way.
Okay, because the standard European design is kind of like a donut almost, isn't it? A kind of ring road around the city. Yeah,
I'm going to put up a few slides there on, cities that are kind of comparable, but also good examples, Copenhagen and Helsinki, and they tend to use the ring road to connect things like the airport that they have out of the city, but close. And then both of them have quite big strategic ports. And of course, Copenhagen has a major bridge to Malmo. Malmo's quite a good example as well. So Malmo has the same sort of quite far out ring road. And Belfast has too. You know, I think on the east and south of the city, the ring road that was built was quite well integrated.
Okay. That's good. Well, do you want to kick off your presentation then? And
I'll try and share screen. I'll sort of... Mm-hmm. Okay, so let me see if we get this. Oh, I can't see my presentation, but give me a second. I have to just call it up. Here's when technology's letting us down again.
Have to talk amongst ourselves. Okay. Oh, here we go.
Are you seeing it now?
Mm-hmm. I sure do.
Yeah. Okay, we'll just start that. So I suppose the other thing I should mention is that since that time in 2012-13, I sat on a group called the Strategic Advisory Board, a strategic advisory group for the York St Interchange. So the Forum for Alternative Belfast was invited into that. And then later, after the 2015 public inquiry, I was invited in on behalf of residents. So in the last 5 years, I've really been sitting on the Department of Infrastructure's advisory group for the interchange, representing residents' concerns.
In your opinion, have the department been amenable? Because sometimes you kind of think a lot of these kind of consultation exercises are kind of box ticking exercises, but have you found the department to be receptive or to be open to suggestions?
Some of the ideas we were making early on were taken on board about roads. So the alignment of the M3 was changed and that allowed a development site. I think we advocated for more paving and better lighting under bridges, and that was kind of worked through with the strategic advisory group. But I think the one thing that's always been a bit disappointing for me was that we couldn't get urban design thinking, as I would call it, so roads has always been the very dominant issue. Even cycling and pedestrian thinking has not really, it's very much second and tertiary in the thinking. So it is a very dominant road scheme to solve a road problem.
Is that because of, are road engineers different then really from kind of urban designers? Are kind of two different disciplines, is it? Yeah,
it's quite different. And really urban design has to be conducted by everybody in the city, but also 4 or 5 different specialists. You have to have a meeting of minds between planners, architects, sociologists, politicians, and engineers. So I was going to mention something else there. I think it's important to say that for a long time it was called the Department of DRD, Department of Regional Development Road Service, and that told you a lot because it told you that the primary thing was roads, but that was changed quite a few years ago to the Department of Infrastructure. So one of the points I'd make in this first slide is that we need to think about infrastructure as infrastructure for everybody. So a pavement is infrastructure, a bridge over a river is infrastructure, a train line is infrastructure, and cycleway is infrastructure. So because we have that broader meaning, I think the department has the remit now. The Department of Infrastructure also now includes strategic planning, which used to be the DOE. So we did suffer from the kind of fragmentation of Northern Ireland governance, and rather than trying to work cross departments and get synergies, I think quite often our system sits in silos, so we talk about that a lot. Okay, well, this is an alternative that grew out of a 2015 public inquiry, and I revised it last year, and actually one of my thinking for that was, the whole change in the global picture in 2019. You had the rise of kind of the narrative that Greta Thunberg was talking about. Mm-hmm. You had the fires in Australia, and now we have COVID. But during that time, I thought the legal challenge to the project had been judged last year as well. And we knew it was going to have to go back. And I thought, well, now has to be a time to think again. Can we really afford this 60-year-old road in carbon terms? So, and I think probably the important thing for governance is really to redefine the brief. So I'm not saying that the brief given back 16 years ago was to join 3 motorways. And I think maybe the brief needs to be reconsidered as to say, how can we solve the core problem? In good government terms, we'd be saying less carbon, less financial cost, faster implementation, wider delivery to all users, and also making kind of wider investments. So saying, well, okay, we're going to build a road, but in the process of building that road, can we actually maximize the development value of land, and can we give that land over to a number of different organizations to develop in a good way? And that maximizes the public expenditure. So not only do we solve a road problem, we solve an urban problem that's been around for 50 or 60 years in this area. Okay. So I think we, as I say, redefine the brief, and I think that allows us to, and allows the engineers to think slightly differently. But I'll take a little zoom out here. I'm not sure if you can see all the text, but we've got the images on top. Yeah. So this is part of the E1. I mean, that concept might be lost now, but the logic of the E1 was that you would connect the ports in all the cities on the eastern seaboard, and it's the European Motorway 1, I assume, which I think goes down to Portugal as well. And that's the logic now that's been used in the last 10 or 20 years, is that we need to get this strategic connection. But if you look at this map, you can see that a route behind the mountains in Belfast would have been a more direct route. And I think that there is a plan for a road there, which I'm not aware of the number. Wesley might know it. But as you zoom in here, you see the airport there in yellow. And the idea that you could connect past Sandy Knolls or even further up, you could connect the motorways from the M2 coming from the north in Ballymena and Randallstown down through the back of the mountains and take that traffic where it wants to go to either the M1 or Ma, down the A1, Dublin and the ports in the south. So Belfast then would be slightly bypassed, and this would actually bring it in line, if we go back, to the kind of way that Helsinki and Malmo organise their very large road infrastructures on the edge of the city and away from people, but strategically connecting ports and airports. So I suppose back in the 60s, they didn't realise that the airport might be so important as it became. And of course, airports now might not be so important anymore. But another strategic problem we've had in Belfast is because we had an airport that was a bit peripheral and wasn't very well connected, it laid the ground for Belfast City Airport to come up. So now we have two airports. And of course, Dublin became a bigger airport. So we've kind of divided our energies in Belfast between two airports. And that, I think that partly is connected to how we thought about the roads. And the other thing I'd point out about this diagram is that then we could still do this. I'm not sure there's the appetite to build so many roads anymore, but we could do the Hill-Hall connection from the outer ring of in the south and east. And that would tend to draw some of the traffic better into Lisburn and the motorway network and on out to... So you could sort of parallel it with the M1 as it comes out of South and West Belfast. And of course that road would take some of the traffic that wants to get from Larne and the M2 off down to Lisburn, and the M1 cross country wouldn't take it into Belfast. So I think that would have been my ideal wider solution in the 60s, was to say that then we would connect into the port and the city of Belfast with a series of feeder roads, and they wouldn't cut through the city so much as feed into it and disperse into it. And that's how a lot of European cities worked, because they didn't want to demolish their whole city centre.
So just to clarify, this that road proposal is how you kind of would have done it, or you're kind of proposing that they still might do this in the future?
Well, I mentioned this recently, and one of the engineers told me that there was actually a road roughly on that route that's in the long-term planning, again, one of these many decades of plans. So I don't think it's been put in as a priority, but you can start to see that Larne would connect down, cross over the M2 and go directly around the back of Belfast, around the back of Lisburn, and connect in, probably even avoiding Sprucefield and Hillsborough, and connect into the A1, which of course really should be a motorway. And then you can go a left turn on the M1 out to Dungannon. So it allows a kind of shortcutting so that we're not drawing traffic into Belfast and through this. Even if we solve this problem of the West Link, and it's still a very overburdened road that has to go slow through the city.
Well, I suppose just before you go on, I mean, it makes sense to ask Wesley. I mean, what's your take on that kind of plan or a road such as like that?
Yes, Mark's correctly pointed out that the motorway system in Belfast is a system that goes right to the centre with roads joining it. And there's two ways of doing motorways. That's one. That's actually similar to the way Glasgow did theirs. They have a very similar setup with a motorway going right through the heart of Glasgow. We have a lot of similarities with Glasgow. And the alternative, as Mark said, is a ring round much further out, which is the way London did it. It's also the way Dublin has done it. And they have their pros and cons. Belfast, it was never really considered to have a big ring round Belfast just because of the presence of the Belfast Hills. I mean, there was a plan to have a dual carriageway around the west of Belfast, but even that would have been very challenging engineering-wise. Excuse me, in terms of the plan that's on our screen there, yes, there is a current plan to upgrade the A26 to a dual carriageway. That's the road that connects the M2 at Templepatrick down through Antrim, Glenaevy, and then down to the roundabout at Moira. So it's the sort of the green line to the left of the red one that you can see there. You would then join the M1 around Moira. So to get to the A1, you would then have to travel east to Sprucefield and come off there. But it's not dissimilar to that. It would be an expensive enough project, but yes, it could be done, and there is a long-term ambition to upgrade that route to dual carriageway standard.
Okay, excellent.
Sorry, just one other point, just is to say, we also need to recognise that the Port of Belfast is by far the biggest port. 2/3 of the freight coming into Northern Ireland comes through Belfast rather than Larne. And Larne isn't that busy at the minute, so connecting up a road up to Larne would imply some sort of moving of freight to Larne away from Belfast.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah, I think that's why I think it's one of the things we've never done very well is make all these strategic decisions at one time. Because if you go back to Helsinki, for instance, they decided a long time ago they were going to move their port out of the centre, which has been active up until the last few years. And now that port has become a major regeneration, but that plan is sitting there 20, 30, 40 years. And they built one of the, a very new deep water port on the edge of Helsinki. So these plans go back a long way. And I think this is part of the reason why, roads planning, airports and ports, weren't really planned together. And I think that probably is down to the Troubles. We didn't really have through the 70s, 80s, 90s, we didn't have the thinking, the time, or maybe the energy or the will to have, quite strategic thinking about how a region would grow as well.
Okay.
So that aspect you would say is down to our kind of checkered economy. Okay. Well, maybe just press on with the.
Yep. Far away. As
we get into Belfast, then that from an urban design point of view, the problem with the motorway. And this is more the way it was done than necessarily had to be done. But the motorway becomes like a wall. It comes down the Cave Hill, along the shore. There's now an idea where the city dump is. There's now the idea of Giants Park. But effectively, what North Belfast, which is one of the poorer areas of Belfast and also one of the most divided and one of the areas that had some of the worst aspects of the Troubles. So it does get defined in socioeconomic terms negatively, even though it has great assets like the Cave Hill and the Green Line there, where the city meets the Cave Hill. But that becomes a kind of natural boundary. If you compare south and east of Belfast and to some extent west, they all connect out to good hinterlands of other towns. So there's multiple roads leading out, small roads. There's multiple villages. And also east and central Belfast take advantage of the river now in the last decades. So you can see the strategic development of the city along rivers is something that happens worldwide. It might change if global warming really kicks off and sea level rises. There's a question about that. But that red line really indicates that motorway hasn't allowed any connections for pedestrians or bridges or underpasses for people to get to work in the docks or take avail of new regeneration that might happen in Belfast Port. And I think it seems to be fairly obvious that Belfast Port will start to shift into being a regeneration project as it sort of already has. As you move closer to the city centre in the second map, you realise that the three streets that are left in that are people in the area would know them to be quite degraded streets. That again, they don't have buildings, and the motorways cut a big swathe through that area and all the buildings with it. And that means that those streets are fairly intimidating walks. So it really means that everybody in North Belfast, which is like a fifth of the population of Belfast, has no access at all to walk and cycle into the city centre. There isn't a proper cycle route. There's very intimidating walks. And you can see the way that, like a tree, North Belfast really depends on those three connections. So it's important that those connections are remade as best we can. And that is slightly connected to the interchange. So again, as we zoom out in the whole area, we see that the interchange is also connected to a wider shatter of the Dunbar Link. And the cranes in the left of that picture are where the University of Ulster is now completing out. So that's a major new shift. The University of Ulster is moving very close to the interchange. You've got the very successful Cathedral Quarter, and at the bottom of the picture you can see the St Anne's Cathedral. So the cathedral area in the last 20 years has become, some would argue, one of the most diverse and successful urban environments. And even though it's got problems, people want to be there. Restaurants have moved there. So it's a success story. The university will move 15,000 students in. That will presumably be quite a success in terms of the people dynamic of that part of the city. But the blue line indicates how much building and activity is going on. And residents in those two pockets, which are outlined in yellowy orange colour, they're really being inundated with a whole series of problems. So as you dig up anything, and everything within this blue line will be dug up in one way or another. Every surface. So you're unleashing rats, old sewers, dust, dirt, noise. So there is a kind of wider environmental impact that I've always argued hasn't been fully considered. If you're building a project this size, you need to have compensatory measures for the city, and especially for those residents. So I don't think another country would be treating the people in that area as badly as they are anticipated to be treated.
What's the population in those kind of yellow areas, roughly? Or?
It's a few hundred that are directly affected. And further up at the bottom end of Tigers Bay, the impacts around the York Street Station. Sailortown is another community that's trying to regenerate. Of course, thousands of people used to live in this area. This area was called Sailortown in the past, and was quite a mixed area leading down into Cathedral Quarter, Little Italy as it was called, and Half Bap. So there was a very continuous, incredible fabric, I should have put up the map actually of it, that the motorways built over in the 60s. So I've always taken the view that, again, we're just thinking about a road. So I want to solve the road problem, but I think I want to solve 10 or 20 other problems at the same time. So that's the motorway with its perimeter and all the works. So the works extend well beyond the central part where the three motorways come together. There's kind of widening of roads, taking away of banks and trees that extends for hundreds and hundreds of metres away from the central part of the motorway. And that's starting to have major impact on residents. So some of the motorway lanes have been widened into the buffer zones against people's back gardens and become very close, 10 metres away and 2 floors above houses. So I'm not getting into too much detail, but just to let you know, there's wide negative impacts for people in their everyday life. But moreover, for the city, you can see the scale of that. And at the end of it, I don't believe it's possible. I've tried for 10 years. I don't believe it's possible to put back the urban environment and the pavements. It's too big a task. It won't happen. So the alternative that we looked at last year, again, has looked at how can we solve that in a minimal area. So how can we get the maximum amount of connectivity for the minimal amount of disturbance and cost? And that's the methodology of this. It's not saying it's a perfect motorway. It's saying what is best for everybody. What is a value judgment about making infrastructure work for every user of the city and a wider interest. I'm going to go through these quite quickly. This is the interchange that would take about 3 to 4 years to build and has 13 temporary phases. So I think people who are coming at this from a view of let's get this motorway built. I think it's important at this point to say the procurement and the start on site couldn't happen for, I think, 2 years. And it takes about 3 years to build. So where we are now with COVID, we're talking to 2026. I think we all know that can extend very easily out to 2030. So we've got to think about, we're trying to build this thing in about 5 years' time. This is not a shovel-ready project. The project has to go into another year of design once it's procured. So the preferred bidder then takes it for another 6 months to 9 months. And only then do we find out the final cost.
Okay,
so the project is not fully designed. So I'm going to flick through these quite quickly. And you see that during the works, the roads have to move around quite a bit. So these are all temporary phases of the motorway.
Mm-hmm.
So that probably would shock some people, and I'll have to let you sit for a while. It's interesting, anyone that has gone through that on their own and just flick backwards and forwards starts to understand just how much pain there is going to be to build a road like that.
Yeah, it looks complicated, like super complicated.
And there's 15,000 students 100 metres away.
Yeah.
So in fact, never mind the residents of one or a few hundred people, we have new residents in the sense that there's 15,000 students being impacted by this as well. So I want to take you through the alternative and explain the interchanges that's happening as well. So this is the problem on a view, and we're going to base all the slides on this view. So these are the main routes. You've got the M2 connecting to the Westlink through in the top of the picture in orange, and that comes down underneath the M3 and stops at a number of lights and then turns sharply onto a street called Great George's Street, where it merges with many other lanes of traffic and is about 6 or 8 lanes wide at that point. And then it connects onto the Westlink. And then we have the traffic on the bottom coming from the Westlink in blue, and the city to the right-hand side. So we have traffics merging onto the M2, and they come on in those blue lines. And then we have other traffic coming across from Bangor direction to the Westlink in magenta. So that's kind of get you the lay of the land. And then one of the things that cuts through the middle of all this is the Westlink traffic through to Bangor. And it's not to say it's that's the only problem, but that does cause half the stops and sort of complicates solutions when you try to accommodate that link. So the starting point of this actually came out at the public inquiry by another person objecting, and he quite carefully pointed and wisely in a way pointed out that the quickest way to solve that problem is actually to use your existing infrastructure. So this design kind of depends on what we would call a hack, actually. It's when you take your IKEA units and you add a few new elements and you make it look like twice the price. So you're trying to take a very kind of standard low cost solution and make that the basis of your design. And this is it. We're going to come to that. The way that the interchange proposes to deal with those problems is to build a new bridge from the M2. So they move the M2 to Westlink over onto a new bridge, and that goes at a very long sweeping curve down 8 metres into the ground, which is about 5 metres below sea level. That needs a pumping station. It also means all the services in Belfast, North Belfast, have to be moved around and in that. And then it builds a very wide series of bridges. It's almost like a enormously wide concrete table, and that has to cut across 4 lanes that go below it. And those lanes that go below it are depressed 2 or 3 metres into the ground as well. And that means that all the services in York Street have to be moved. And then over the top of that bridge, you have 5 lanes, I think, of quite wide traffic, which means it'll be going quite fast, and 2 sets of lights. And on each side, you've got pedestrians and cycles. So one of the things that I've always felt is that the design of this bridge is very heavy traffic dominated. And it means that the evening traffic has to go through 2 sets of lights to get out of the city. And that means it backs up into the Dunbar link and around the university. So that's in essence. So I think the important thing is this can't really be implemented until 2026. So I know a lot of people watching this will be going, let's get that road built, let's get investment in jobs. And I'm not disagreeing with that. Let's get this road built, let's get it built faster, and let's get the same amount of jobs and investment, in fact more. So I'm very pro the idea that we solve this problem, but I think there's very high risks for this strategy. It could still face legal actions. And, there's things like the decision at Heathrow, which has been challenged again, but the Heathrow decision really was saying that when you're making big infrastructure decisions, you've got to do a proper carbon audit, and you've got to say how it's going to meet our IPCC objectives that we signed up to. And
now,
I find,
when you say implemented, does that mean actually ready, finished, or is it
finished?
Started, finished? Okay,
finished. So minimum, I think 6 years away. So people, I understand drivers and hauliers and various interests in the city want to get this problem solved, want to get rid of these traffic lights. But as I went through on those slides, you've got to remember this is a difficult build to build, and it won't be finished for quite a long time.
Yeah, it looks like it.
So to go back to the kind of step-by-step solution, if we take that Bangor link and we say, let's take it around an existing bridge in Dock Street, and that gets what's called grade separation. So it's a bit like, I always say, it's a bit like untying a knot in your shoelaces. If you can get that one out, suddenly the rest of the solution can fall into place and you can open your shoelaces a little bit. So that's the analogy I use, and I think also it's about saying that's the Dock Street Bridge. It can be improved for pedestrians and lit and various things, but there is a bank there that has a retaining wall at the back, and a new wall can be added, and we can get essentially 2 lanes of traffic there, or 1 wide lane with a breakdown lane, through under that bridge, and we can let it run essentially free flow or with minimal lights, and let it connect back up through what's called Nelson Street and up the existing slipway to Bangor. So that's about trying to get that traffic flowing. And then as part of that, I would take the local traffic around that same loop. So this is land in behind the train line. Mm-hmm. So the other thing to look at is that little route behind the train line and that connection at Dock Street, that could be built as a first phase almost without anyone knowing it was happening. You could have a series of trolls working away there. I don't think anybody in the city would know that was even being done until it was ready to open. So it's very low impact. But you're taking the local traffic out up at York Street Station, and you don't let it go down York Street. And that the reasons for that become clear later. Sort of almost the final phase actually is to say, well, of course, then we need to get York Street and over the top of all these motorways. So we do build a series of bridges, but I would build 3 separate structures. I would build 1 wide structure for people and bikes, which can be more lightweight. I would build in blue a series of local roads, which would be slow, 20, 25 miles an hour, and that's like a local arterial route. And then we build essentially a slip lane that lets evening traffic go on to the M2 as it does at the moment and just joins in with the traffic running underneath the bridge. So zooming into that, that's an example of the sort of walkway. There could be a major, symbol essentially of a new university connecting to York Street train station, and a major symbol of North Belfast renewal would be to create a wide cycle and pedestrian link. This is a former 1970s road in Seoul, and it was repurposed to make this sort of pedestrian connection over. Underneath you can see very, very big traffic infrastructure below. Seoul is a very traffic dominated city as well in the 70s and 80s. And you can see even at night time that can be well lit up as a major route. And the trees are just planted where the columns are, so there's no heavy engineering involved. So that's that. And as you zoom in, that's how I would do that. So I would gather all the pavements and cycling into one sort of what I've called a super wide connector at York Street. And that really connects where most people are in the university to where most people want to go, which is city side on that side of the street, and then on up to the station and into York Road. And the other then would be the direct link onto the motorway has no traffic lights then from the university point. So
just that I'm clear, so the reason why you have this kind of elevated York Street is that it kind of allows kind of like the traffic from the West Link, etc., free movement, whereas currently it's stopping at the lights.
Yeah.
York Street, is that basically the idea?
Yeah. So this idea is essentially the same as the current interchange. It is to build an overpass, as it's called. Mm-hmm. But I would suggest that because the roads below are on grade level, I wouldn't think they're worth sinking. I think we just build this bridge with a thinner structure. Because it has to span much less, it can be designed much simpler. And the road on the right of there, the slip road, only has to go over one section of road. So we're bringing in the evening traffic directly onto the M2 rather than over it and then connecting it on. So this is a kind of technical detail we'll probably not get into, but this is trying to solve it in the simplest way. And then finally, rather than building the big sweeping curve in the new bridge, I would say we've lived 40 years with this solution as it is, ad hoc. And I think, again, this idea of how do we solve the brief in the simplest, fastest, cheapest way possible. Not about how do we design a perfect motorway. So we take the traffic off at the M2 West Link, we put it into a 30 mile an hour zone, and we put a gentle curve, gentler than shown there, and we realign those roads away from Great George Street and up onto new roads. So we get a new curve there, we take the traffic light out, and that curve can be designed for around 30 miles an hour. And that means that we go into a kind of forced speed control. So everybody coming up the M2, getting through the West Link in peak time, can't drive more than 30 miles an hour, but I would be surprised if the West Link is going at 30 miles an hour. So the real problem in this whole system isn't really York Street Interchange. It is also D Street. It is the West Link itself. It is the fact that the West Link has a lot of commuter traffic on it, which isn't strategic through traffic on a motorway. So the whole system is compromised. And we've got to recognise that the whole system can never be uncompromised now. It's too late for that. So we have to, and in my view, cage our solutions on utter pragmatism rather than getting caught up and letting what I would call the tail wag the dog. You know, we can't let the regulations wag the whole dog. So that then allows an enormous amount of regeneration, and it solves the interchange in the tightest space possible at the lowest budget. So we haven't dug into the ground, and we've had to build a series of bridges at York Street, which we can build in a very high quality way. And it means that public land is not being wasted and can be there sort of put into a land trust and developed over time in a good way. And it means that we get, and this for me is the real win then for Belfast, so solving the road problem now, and there are on-off compromises that are happening in that, but some of them are better, some of them are denied. But this becomes a kind of infrastructure for all. So it does mean that we can say cycling and walking and the regeneration of streets and the regeneration of connections from North Belfast that has been cut off from the whole city for 50 years, that's that fifth of a population of the major city has a right. It has a right to connect through this area, and that right can't be denied its place as well. So to make safe and good walking connections are all those yellow routes, all those sort of orange and yellow connections are reimagined as walking routes that can be designed well, can have buildings, trees, landscape, and essentially make a net and connection. And from an urban design point of view, we know that the best cities are always ones with grids. So it's not about getting from A to B in one road or one street. We all know that where you can take 4 or 5 streets, connect from your university to your docks, those 4 or 5 streets will sort of give you lots of choice. It means you can have more people and businesses living there, and sort of what I would call deepens the connection. So in urban design terms, we always like gridded cities and cities that have multiple routes. And I think the real test of that came on the Primark fire. So suddenly you realise the city, part of the city that had only one route connecting through in front of Primark, all the other routes have been blocked by Castle Court and a number of streets that have been lost over the years. And suddenly that route was denied. And then suddenly we realised, half the city is grinding to a halt because we were over-dependent on one route. So that again really emphasises in tangible terms to people why you need multiple street connections in a city to make it work. Yeah. So you're spreading the investment into the wider streets and the cycle networks. So you're meeting the needs of infrastructure. I would say that it's essential that some of this budget is now used for 2 bridges over the Lagan, 2-foot and cycle bridges mainly. One at the Clarendon area and one up at the Titanic to connect onto the Titanic. And that's a game changer. Everybody in North Belfast who's seen this presentation thinks this would change North Belfast immensely for the good and would deal with enormous social problems because the Shore Road axis, the York Street station and the Duncairn axis would connect half of North Belfast into Titanic water quite quickly. So that again is what I would call a game changer. But to do that, we've got to make Dock Street a habitable, walkable street. Okay. So that's kind of urban design implications. I'm going to go through another few slides. I think the other point to make is it's taken 60 years to get to this point. So this road was conceived in 1960 roughly. And we're 60 years down the line and we're probably 10, 20 years when there will be major changes in the way we think about travelling. We may go to electric vehicles, even freight may go electric and driverless. In fact, most of our freight could be delivered at night in driverless vehicles when the road network is not even used by humans anymore. There's all sorts of possibilities we might have in 20 or 30 years. So don't forget, we've 60 years behind us, 20 or 30 years of change coming in front of us. Major global challenges. would it be the right time to build a road below sea level? Would it be the right time to spend an enormous carbon cost in concrete, basically building a very heavy piece of infrastructure when it only has 10 or 20 or 30 years lifespan left? So that's another reason I think is when you do a kind of carbon cost benefit analysis of this, it also pushes, I think, the whole interchange to be recast as saying, look, we've got to be very pragmatic here. We can't afford to be spending that much money on solving a road problem. We've got to solve it and solve other problems as well. So as you move into the kind of urban design, the purple areas are all new buildings. We can put back streets, we can have connections. And interlaced into that is the solution of the interchange. This is a drawing at slightly bigger scale, so we're actually drawing this in computer programs, checking the radii and the elevations and so on. So trying to show this can be solved in physical terms. And I'll just put this slide in as well. You're like, why is he going to Paris? So this is a slide, the next slide is a slide I took about 10 years ago, and I always put it up. You see that roundabout just behind the pyramid? There's a 4-lane road underneath that. So that's the pyramid and the Louvre in Paris, connecting through to the Tuileries Gardens and about 10 miles out to Versailles. So it's a major, major piece of French infrastructure. There's another view. I'll just click back, you see it's the same building. So there's a 4-lane road slipped in underneath, and around that road on the upper end is a big, well-designed hedge, and quite carefully designed pavements and walls, and even a nice light at the right-hand side, and trees, as you can see, in the gardens. And I think this really illustrated to me. I just happened to come across this part of Paris from this direction, and I was dumbfounded because I'd always come the other way and never realised this road existed. And I think that just shows that the good design between roads and people is possible. And this was another example, that Seoul walkway. This is the design drawing for that, and it shows how it connects across a railway infrastructure between two parts of the city, and that's why it was necessary. And you can see there's a lot of cars in that photograph as well. But I think none of this costs extra money. It's just about good design. It really does not cost extra money to do this. This is a slide going back to 2011, was an early sketch at that time. And I always envisioned that this area needed to be repaired with a kind of whole green new quarter. We've got to move on to thinking about how do we do buildings and spaces sustainably. And how do we mix all these uses in a way that allows people to walk, use space, use buildings? And I think the other important thing people need to remember who commute into the city and so on is everybody at the end of the day is always a pedestrian. Mm-hmm. You might drive your car, you might drive your lorry, you might use the things that come off that lorry, but you as a person always have to go into a building. You always have to work in a building or live in a home where you are the pedestrian. So I think we've got to stop having this debate between wars between different interest groups. We all have to use these infrastructures together in a respectful way, I think, and recognise the needs of others, and recognise that we will always be a pedestrian at some point. We will always have children who are cycling bikes. So there is a kind of, you see it on Twitter, people get this road built, let's get roads building, let's spend money. Yes, no problem with that. But I think we've got to have a more respectful and mature thought about the way we use road space. And that kind of maybe leads into the next conversation. And there's a view of what that part of the city could be like as the docks slowly change into a kind of new regeneration post. It seems obvious to me that a large part of the docks might connect further up the motorway at Fort William. They have other routes out. Mm-hmm. And, this part of the city is more ripe for development in the longer term. I think that's maybe the last slide. This is the model that we made in 2012 with students, 25 students, sort of having a go. It was a different design, but having a go at how to do housing and mixed use through that area. So,
excellent. And I know. Have you ever tried to have your kind of alternative proposal costed, or a rough idea of how we compare, or to?
I think we have a pretty good idea that it's probably a third of the price very easily, because we're not proposing to go into the ground at all, really. Of course, there may be services moved, but we don't need to build a pumping station. we don't need to worry so much about flooding. In fact, the roads could be carefully designed to act as a flood barrier for much of the city. So you could get two things out of that. And, you know, you can see on some of the earlier slides that the impact is that we accept more of the existing infrastructure we've got. So we're spending a lot less on widening the motorway hundreds of meters away from the interchange. And I think finally I'd make the point, this is about getting traffic through Belfast at peak hour. It's not about calculating, can I drive 1 minute faster through Belfast? It's about when the rush hour is on, how can we get the maximum amount of traffic through in the minimum time? And if you think of a big slinky spring, the way traffic works when it's in crowd mode, the slower, even speed traffic is what gets most traffic through. It's when people start speeding and braking and
stopping,
weaving and stuff. That's what slows the traffic down and causes big traffic jams. So you want to just get people through. So this is about getting people through without the lights and doing it in a kind of pragmatic way.
Sounds good. Right, Wesley, what's your take on Mark's ideas?
Thank you, Mark. Very, very interesting, and there's a lot to say on that. And if I maybe start at the sort of the highest level, Mark correctly pointed out that the Belfast motorway network sort of serves two functions, and that's because of its origins in the 1960s, where it was envisaged as, you know, unapologetically a commuter route for getting into the city centre, which means that Westlink is festooned with local junctions. So you can get on and off this motorway network in a lot of places, and that's sort of its Achilles heel, because nowadays the role of the motorway network really is for strategic long distance traffic heading to Dublin or up to Derry or the ports, and this strategic traffic is what we're trying to facilitate. But the problem is that these junctions, and especially York Street ones, also have lots of local traffic and lots of commuters on it trying to get to the local streets, and it's very, very difficult with what we've already got to try and separate those out. You can't really separate the strategic traffic out from the local traffic anymore, just because of the legacy of what's been built. That's what makes it difficult. So you can improve strategic movements, but you will at the same time also facilitate more of what we don't really want to facilitate right now, which is encouraging people to drive their cars into the city centre. So in terms of the design of this junction, the design that is proposed for here, that's the current plan, is essentially a design that is built to urban motorway standard. The idea is to maximise the vehicle throughput. That's really the design brief, is to get as many vehicles through the junction as possible. So the long sweep, is it the slide before that one? The long sweep out towards Corporation Street is designed to get the one with the 8 metre, yes, that one, that big orange line is designed to get vehicles round onto the Westlink at sort of a design speed of perhaps 50 miles an hour, and that's why it's needed. 40 miles an hour, that's why it's needed. It's also a lot wider than it needs to be, because you need a long forward sight line when you're going around a curve. Everything else then is built on top of this requirement. So Mark's right to say that, you know, the movements of the vehicles has been the number one consideration in the design of this junction. So in terms of whether it is feasible, in engineering terms, it's feasible. It's complicated, it's feasible. Now, whether that design is appropriate, I think, is a wider question for society, and I think that's a valid point in this location, because we're a mile from the City Hall here, and I think it is right that we ask the question whether we want a road of this type, and it's right that society asks that question. So it's not purely a matter of what is needed to facilitate vehicles. So I think it's right to question that. I'll go out on a limb and say I don't think that the junction in the design that is proposed is going to happen, and two reasons for that. One is, I think the design of the junction, which has been in place now for 14 years, by the time we come around to designing it, I think it's going to be the type of design that society would reject. I also think that with the ruling of Heathrow Airport, I think the design of the junction as it stands is highly susceptible to a legal challenge, which would delay it. And with COVID-19, I think there's a question mark over whether we will have the money to build this. We don't have the money now because it was DUP Tory pact money, and it's not clear to me whether that money still exists. Even if we do have that money, it's going to be quite a few years before it hits the ground. I think Mark mentioned 2016 for completion as an earliest possible date, which I think would be optimistic given the fact that legal challenges can delay things by several years. So I'm not convinced that it's going to happen in the form proposed. So I think if that's the situation we find ourselves in, then I think it's right to look at alternatives. So I think Mark's plan here does have a lot of promise. I think it is worth seriously considering. There would be, lots of little things you could point out, but to be honest, they wouldn't be deal breaker things. They would be more like the type of thing you would go through in a design process. So another thing I would say is in terms of traffic flow, the design of York Street Interchange as proposed is to get traffic through the junction in a free flow capacity. Now that's always going to be limited by what you're connecting onto. The M2 is the only one of those three roads that then heads off continuously with no further traffic lights. The M3 stops traffic lights at D Street, which is a big bottleneck. There is a plan to grade separate D Street. Again, I think that's a long way in the future if it happens at all, and then you've got Knocknagonie after it anyway. And then on Westlink, you have a whole series of junctions. And what causes congestion, as I think Mark said, is weaving and junctions. Those are the two things that cause congestion. Once traffic is moving in a straight line, it's fairly easy to keep it moving. So even if you built York Street in its current form, I don't think it's going to free flow at rush hour onto the M3 or onto Westlink. So at peak hours, I don't think it would look quite as great as it sounds on the ground or on the plans. That said, any design that you build along the type that Mark is proposing would just by its nature not have as much capacity as the junction that DFI are proposing, because you have these tight bends, reduced speed limits, some traffic lights. And again, I think this is why I'm glad that we have the executive back, because you need a minister to make calls like this. This is a question for society, and that's the minister's role, is to decide policy and then DFI implement it. So coming down then to the design specifically, if it's okay to continue, the link, taking the link from the Westlink around to the M3, I think that could work. I hadn't seen it before moved into behind York Street, so the traffic wouldn't actually be on York Street itself. I think that's a good idea. I think when you got to the Dock Street Bridge, you've got two 90-degree turns, and you would probably need some engineers to look at the sweeps that you would get there. Mark's a sensible guy. I suspect he's already done things like that. So just whether you could get the sweeps, you need to imagine, you've got two lanes going around there, and if you have two articulated lorries going along side by side, you need to have decent space for them.
I suppose at that point, Wesley,
yes.
I would suggest it's one lane of traffic, because you come off the slip road on a lane, you just keep a single lane. So the way I've shown two lanes is really a breakdown capacity.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. So you've got a hard shoulder essentially, and a one lane. Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. When you get to your 90-degree corners, now there are tons of examples of 90-degree corners on the road network. There's one Middle Path Street Bridge End on the east side of the city. Whether you can build a brand new one without just that doesn't exist now, I think you would just need to see whether that's allowed. If it's not allowed by the current manual for roads, you might need to think about something like traffic signals, just to make sure traffic can get safely around those corners. Then when you're running along Nelson Street, which is on this diagram, it's the purple line towards the top of the diagram, traffic would be coming around that corner on the right-hand side of Nelson Street, and would then need to move across to the left-hand side to get up onto the M3. which would conflict with traffic joining Nelson Street locally and wanting to head on into the city or round up onto the West Link. So that's not a deal breaker, but to manage that weaving, it would be a bit like the M3 lagging bridges today. You would need to have a long weaving section or possibly a traffic signal just to make sure that that weaving movement is regulated. So it would reduce the capacity, but I think Mark's right. If you got that movement out of the way, the remaining bits of the junction would slot together. The design does hinge a little bit on reducing local access to and from the road network here in some places. And I would particularly note, I think Mark and I talked about this before, how you would access Belfast Port from the road network here. It's not clear to me exactly how you would access Belfast Port from the West Link, for example. Mark, maybe you want to explain what you said about that?
Well, I suppose you could come off on behind the train line there, and you could access it in a local junction at the very top left, so you could get into the port that way from the West Link. And then getting out, I think I prefer, and the local community would prefer, that a lot of that traffic was maybe geared up towards a further section. There is a piece of work going on up at Whitla Street and then further up at the Fort William roundabout. So there's kind of ways they can get out that way. But given what you're saying about weaving, not technically, but it is physically possible to come on at Nelson Street and still get onto the M2 West Link and go off south from the port. But I think the amount of weaving going on there would probably need lights to allow that to happen. So at the minute you can come around that corner, just where the word M2 is, M2 to West Link, at that point you can come along and get on to the West Link connection, weaving across. Some people will know that link exists. And that was also taken out during the York Street. The current design doesn't allow that movement. So I think the current design is actually pushing the traffic further up to Whitla Street, where I think there's, I haven't looked at that one in detail, but there's a kind of new on junction at Whitla Street. And that could still be done in some form, I think.
That's right. Yes, so there was the very first plan they looked at was having an on slip onto the M2 West Link, the yellow one on the screen there. But they found that they couldn't do that because of the flooding risk. You're basically creating a sink there. And I think they wanted to put a flood wall on either side of that thing. So yes, they built a kind of a rather convoluted slip road further up to get it above sea level. And then just a couple of other points. One is there's a long-term ambition to widen the railway viaduct to two-track. So as part of York St Interchange, the idea is that at the same time they will widen the foundations of the railway viaduct. So you would just need to be careful when you're building, say, that purple link close to the viaduct, that you wouldn't, compromise that in the future. And finally, coming up from the M3 onto West Link, which is the sort of magenta line, I think, at the bottom right there. That's presumably one lane, Mark, as
I think you would. Well, I think what I would prefer for the city is that we leave Nelson Street open, so the current interchange actually closes off Nelson Street traffic and doesn't allow it into the city. That means a lot. It hasn't actually been talked about very much, but it means a lot of North Belfast traffic will be forced onto Corporation Street or North Queen Street, and it means those roads will get worse. So I think Nelson Street is still a good connector into the city. So I would actually propose that purple line, we do accept traffic lights. So when you come off, there might be 3 lanes at the end of the mouth of that, so traffic can not stack up on the motorway. So it's very much like the current situation. You come down to a traffic light. So I would say we should accept a traffic light there.
Okay.
But as soon as you get past that, then you're linking on in a single lane.
Linking onto West Link. Okay, so the West Link is 2 lanes wide. So you have 2 lanes coming around from the M2, which means that the one lane coming up from the M3 direction would need to merge into that. The current design for York Street shows something very similar, and the way they've resolved that is to continue that new lane on as far as Clifton Street, and then it diverges again at the Clifton Street off-slip. And that requires North Queen Street Bridge to be widened by 1 lane on the city side. So you might still, with this design, require North Queen Street Bridge to be widened on that side. It would just be something you'd need to look at. On the whole, though, I like Mark's design. I was a fan of the FAB plan for what you would do with the existing plan, which was the hand-drawn diagram that you showed at the very end of your presentation.
Yeah, this model as well.
That one, I was a big fan of that. I thought that was basically the junction as proposed, but with a lot more built environment around it. And I think that's a very, very good plan. My view on this is I think the road network is important, and I think something needs to be done about this junction. But at the same time, this is a mile from City Hall. It's a very, very sensitive area, and it has been decimated by the road network. There's no doubt about it. And I think this is one location where I think it is right to take a wider perspective and see this as a built environment project and not purely a roads project. So, I think what Mark's doing here is good. I think it's well worth looking at. And I think with the situation with money and COVID, I think we are going to have to look at solutions like this. The solution would be easy to implement. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, because I'm just trying to think, if I was Nicola Mallon, who's also a representative of North Belfast, which obviously is going to be a factor, I would be thinking that, is it better to have something that kind of gets you most of what you want, but you can get it done cheaper, you can get it done quicker, without all the legal challenges and all the nonsense and the cost? Do you know what I'm saying? So I think from a political point of view, Mark's proposal kind of makes sense in that it's more realistic. Does that make sense? Because if it kind of gets you more or less what you're after, is it not the best way of going for it?
That's right. This is one location, I think, where nobody will get everything they want from this. The current design, nobody gets what they want from it. The proposed design, nobody gets everything they want from it. Mark's design, I think, is a good compromise, to be honest. Yes, I think, and I think it's worth considering. And it's Nicola Mallon has spoken out very vocally in favour of pedestrian and cycling as two forms of sustainable transport that we should be pushing. And if that translates into policy, if she's successful in getting that translated into policy, then that would mean big changes, and this sort of thing is where that would hit the ground.
Okay, perfect. Well, I think that's. Have you anything else to say, Mark, before we move on to the general kind of roads network?
Well, I suppose I've had this on the screen for a while, and you see at the top there, you've got Duncairn Gardens, which used to be a former peace line, and it's a very nice street, but it connects into much of North Belfast further up. And you've got Shore Road coming down at York Street Station. And there is the idea that York Street Station, I think, does need jewelled and needs to be turned into a better train station for the new university as well. And for the sector, apparently, there's a lot of people using the station now, walking through that area to go to the new buildings in the Harbour Masters area, where they're building a lot of office space. So I think when you look at it on the wider aspect of Cathedral or Titanic Quarter at this end, a new university, there's a number of drivers here, but I think as well, I would view this also as a kind of peace project, because North Belfast has been badly cut off from the city, and to not focus on its internal problems, but actually focus back out into the university, into the Clarendon area, across the Titanic Quarter, where you've got the paint studios and a film industry. You have a lot of jobs in those areas, and people need access to jobs, and especially in this area of the city, they could walk, they could cycle. But we would need to reimagine those streets. So this plan is really saying, yes, we would save a lot of money on the major road in the middle, but actually that money could be spent in trying to get more walkable and cyclable streets all around. And I think the very significant one from the University of Ulster and down at Clifton House is changing the Dunbar link. So suddenly letting that traffic flow from the corner of York Street onto the M2 24/7 over its own bridge without pedestrians getting in the way, it lets that commuter traffic get out. And of course we need to manage that over the next few decades, that we try to get people out of cars, but it's always going to be there. And we need to free up the streets around. That's another point.
For it. So Wesley, as the kind of the Simon Cowell of the Northern Ireland road scene, is this getting your vote? Has Mark convinced you? Is it?
I think for me, the best scheme would be a scheme that delivered the benefits of the scheme that's proposed, but with a much better built environment. But since I'm coming around to the view now that that scheme is not going to happen, I don't think it's going to be feasible for many reasons. I think this scheme would be the best one to look at in the absence of the other one. I do.
So the main scheme is Marks and Spencer's. This is the kind of the cheap kind of practical version. It's kind of doable. Yeah.
I mean, it's an eminently sensible scheme given the budget constraints we have and the conflicting interests there are on this site.
Okay, good stuff. Well, I think because I know we're running out of time, so we'll just finish up quickly with I was going to say your views on where we stand in our new kind of post-COVID-19 world, because I know there's a lot of people working from home now, and it's unrealistic to think that we're just going to sit in our houses forever. Obviously, we're going to come back to the offices at some stage, but you can see how there's going to be more hybrid work, in that people work a day or two from home a week. For example, if more people work from home on Friday, we could get rid of our horrendous Friday traffic problems. So with that in mind, I mean, do you have any views on how that's going to kind of influence the kind of road network and the road design going forward?
Yeah, so, the capacity of the road network is very sensitive. I mean, we have a traffic management system in Belfast, and it doesn't take that much of a reduction in traffic to significantly clear things up. We've seen that over the last few weeks. Traffic levels are sitting at maybe 50% during rush hour of what they normally were, and they've been very, very clear. We don't know, as you say, what's going to happen in the future, but if it's the case that people are going to be working differently, commuting at different times, commuting less often, then you could have a situation where it turns into the summer holidays all the time on the road network. If that's the case, then I think, given that we are stewards of public money when we're building roads, I think it would make sense to stop and reconsider what we're building. Even if we decide on the basis of that to continue with what we're doing, I think it would be wise to say, no, let's just pause for a second here and see what's happening. And then there's two possible outcomes of that. One is that it means that there might be some schemes we decide are no longer necessary. On the other side, it means that there are some schemes which would have just filled up with cars again after a few years that might actually be more feasible because they maybe wouldn't fill up with cars again after such a long time. So it could go either way. You could see some schemes benefiting from lower traffic since it makes them more sensible, and other schemes become redundant, don't happen at all. But I certainly think in the next year, we need to sit and take a look at this.
Yeah, because I think the issue with roads has always been, if you make the road network too good, then more people will drive and commute into work. So it's a kind of a balance, isn't it, between, you don't want it too good that it just kind of fills up the road and you end up with like 10-lane American superhighways. But obviously it needs to be good enough for, the essential transport, the road haulage, etc., for it to work. So it's always kind of like a balance between the two.
It is, yes. The whole point of the road network is to facilitate travel for all kinds of reasons. So if you built a new road and it didn't attract more traffic, it would have been a failure. I mean, the whole idea is to get more travel, and most infrastructure, buses, cycling, trains, you'd be disappointed if you built something and nobody continued to use it. So it comes down then to a higher level decision on what types of transport we want people to be using. That gets you into the whole area of to what extent the government has the right to influence people's choice on that, to what extent we let people make their own decisions on that, how you take into account wider interests like climate change, and all that goes into the bag. And then your infrastructure decisions. People sometimes say infrastructure, this particular decision is a political decision. I would say all infrastructure is a political decision, because everything you're doing has some impact on society and influences the way we live. So it's unavoidable.
Okay, and Mark, what's your take on our kind of post-COVID-19 world? Because I was kind of struck particularly what you said about like autonomous transport, which Which I know that people listening to this will sound like, like science fiction, but that's probably like 5-10 years tops away. I mean, I know that they've got working models in America. They got autonomous trucks and things like that. So that is quite a good idea, that you could just have a lot of kind of deliveries done at night by autonomous vehicles. Sounds pretty impressive. So
well, I think it's maybe a little bit further away, but not too far away. I mean, I think it makes sense when you think that in an Uber taxi, 9/10 of the cost is the driver. Now, I'm not saying we have to move very quickly to put people out of work, but you can see in the future that certain areas of driverless technology would make sense. It would make sense to take long haulage freight and put it into autonomous nighttime vehicles, which wouldn't disturb anyone, which could go along at 20 or 30 miles an hour very slowly between Belfast and Enniskillen. And, at a time when less people are around, I think, rural networks are always going to need drivers, aren't they? So there's a number of debates here. I think the big one we've got for the next 10 years is we have atrocious air quality. I mean, I live in Belfast, not too far away from this zone, and the air quality has improved massively, and the walking experience on our arterial routes is massively improved. But I think one thing that everybody who's noticed on their daily walk or shop, because that's all we do now, I've noticed the traffic is sometimes more respectful, sometimes driving slower, and people are more on the streets and walking into the street sometimes. So space is being shared in an organic fashion in parts of the city that work well, like Ormer Road and so on. But there has been incidents of a lot of people speeding too much in cities and in built-up areas. So I think there's issues we need to talk about. I think many drivers are suddenly aware that if you are in an accident and you end up in A&E, or you cause someone else to end up in AE just at this moment, you're doing something else to the health service. So people have been, I think, gradually more cautious. And what if we started thinking like that all the time? I notice it in my own driving that I'm doing very infrequently now. I am a little bit more conscious myself of being respectful of other users. And I notice it going on. But then there is a level of very, very bad incidents happening in Belfast of people driving 40, 50, 60 miles an hour in city streets. And that needs to be clamped down. So I think there's two things there. There's air quality. We need to talk about the rights of people to have air. It's just simple. It's connected to COVID as well, pollution. Air quality in parts of Belfast are as bad as anywhere in the Western world. Mm. And that's not acceptable. We've got to solve that problem. So the whole idea that Wesley mentioned as well, like if we could start to move away from employment, getting in at 9 o'clock. I mean, so many employers are just kind of tyranny of, are you in at 8:30 or 9 or 10? Why aren't we working flexibly from home for 1 or 2 days of the week? Why aren't we changing our pattern so that we spread the traffic? It's only logical. I mean, a child could think like that. Why does everybody have to get in at 9 o'clock to Belfast? That doesn't make any sense. It never made any sense. And we now question it. We now have gone through a month or 6 weeks of realizing we don't need to go anywhere. Some of us can work on. Some people, yes, need to use the city, of course, but we could spread that. And if we spread it, we could have a more intelligently run city that is more civilized, really.
Yeah, well, I think Nicola Malin has been quite progressive. I know she's kind of brought in the new rules around electric bikes and things like that, and she seems open to the idea of making more cities cycling friendly, more walkable. So I hope that she's taken a lot of these ideas on board. Now, I know that's probably us for time. So I just want to thank Mark and Wesley for joining me today.
Thank you.
If you have enjoyed the Slugger Tool podcast, please subscribe to get future episodes, and we'll see you on the next episode. Right, guys. The Slugger Tool podcast is sponsored by Queen's University Belfast. Researchers at Queen's are at the heart of supporting global efforts to understand the coronavirus. To discover more about their research, please visit qub.ac.uk.